My name is Clara Finch, and I'm 24 years old. In another life, I was an artist, a woman who found her voice not in conversation, but in the sweeping lines of charcoal on paper. I never knew that the silence I had chosen for myself would one day be forced upon me, becoming a prison forged from a single, horrifying moment. The silence that nearly destroyed me, however, also became my greatest weapon, and the key to a connection deeper than any words I had ever known. It was in that profound quiet that I met the man who would save my life, a man whose own silence was a fortress around a past I could only guess at. He was a Bow Street runner, a guardian forged in the crucible of London's grimiest streets, and he was my only hope. Before I tell you how a man who never spoke a kind word taught me the true meaning of trust, and how the face I could never forget became the one I had to draw to survive, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from today. Let me know in the comments down below. And if you've ever felt like no one was listening, or that you didn't have a voice, maybe hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers here, make sure to subscribe, because this channel is a place where we share stories about finding strength in the most unexpected of places. The rain fell in sheets, blurring the gaslights of Covent Garden into watery, indistinct stars. It was a miserable night, the kind that drove people indoors, leaving the cobbled streets slick and empty, save for the desperate or the damned. I was merely drenched, my portfolio held tight under my cloak as I hurried home from a late commission. I'd been illustrating a new edition of Gothic poems, and my mind was still full of shadowed castles and spectral figures. I took a shortcut through a narrow alley, a passage I'd used 100 times, thinking only of a warm fire and a cup of tea. That was my first mistake. The sound was what stopped me. Not a scream, but a wet, choked gasp, followed by a heavy thud. It was a sound that didn't belong to the city's usual chorus of carriage wheels and distant bells. It was intimate, and it was final. I pressed myself into a recessed doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs. Two figures were visible in the dim light at the alley's end. One was on the ground, a portly, well-dressed man I recognized as Lord Harrington, a merchant whose offices were nearby. The other stood over him, a tall, elegant silhouette against the hazy glow. I saw the glint of a knife, saw it rise and fall again, a brutal, silent punctuation to a sentence already finished. The standing man knelt, wiping the blade on the dead man's coat. Then he turned. For a single, eternal second, his face was illuminated by a passing carriage lamp. It was a handsome face, patrician and cold, with eyes that held no heat, no remorse, only a chilling, businesslike finality. Our eyes met across the 20 yards of wet cobblestone. There was no flicker of surprise in his expression, only a quiet assessment, a flicker of annoyance, as if I were a minor inconvenience, a smudge on his otherwise perfect evening. Then he was gone, melting back into the London dark. I was left alone with the body and the rain, and the image of those eyes burned into my mind. I opened my mouth to scream, to call for help, to make any sound at all, but nothing came out. The scream was trapped, a physical thing lodged in my throat, choking me. The shock had slammed a door inside my head, and my voice was locked on the other side. That was the night my world went silent. Days later, the silence remained. It was a heavy blanket, suffocating and constant. The Bow Street runners had found me, huddled and shivering, a few streets away. They had questioned me, but my lips would not form words. My hands, the hands that could render life on paper with such precision, could only tremble. I was the only witness to the murder of a powerful man, and I was useless. That's when he arrived at my boarding house. My landlady, the kindly Mrs. Gable, showed him to my small room. He filled the doorway, a man built of sharp angles and grim resolve. He was not old, perhaps 35, but his face was a map of hard miles, with a pale scar that cut through one eyebrow, giving him a permanent look of cynical disapproval. He introduced himself with a low growl. Gideon Blackwood, Bow Street. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a word of comfort. His eyes, a shade of slate gray, swept the room, cataloging every detail, every charcoal sketch pinned to the wall, before they landed on me. He looked at me not as a victim, but as a problem to be solved, a broken tool. In his gaze, I felt my inability to speak, not as a trauma, but as a personal failing, an infuriating complication in his investigation. This gruff, no-nonsense man was to be my bodyguard, my protector. He looked more dangerous than the man in the alley. Magistrate Collins, a man whose powdered wig seemed to absorb all the light in his stuffy office, looked at Gideon over a stack of files. The situation is delicate, Blackwood. Lord Harrington was a man of considerable influence. His partners at the East India Company are demanding answers. The press is calling it a robbery gone wrong, but his wallet was untouched. Gideon stood with his arms crossed, his expression unchanging. And our only witness? Collins sighed, tapping a finger on his desk. A young woman, an artist, Clara Finch. The shock seems to have stolen her voice. The physicians call it a hysterical affliction. Gideon's lip curled slightly. Hysteria, convenient. He had little time for the fragile sensibilities of the upper classes, and even less for afflictions he couldn't see or punch. A silent witness is no witness at all, magistrate. What am I to do? Guard a ghost? Collins leaned forward, his voice dropping. You are to keep her alive. The killer saw her. We found scuff marks in the alley, her dropped sketchbook. He knows someone was there. If he's bold enough to kill a man like Harrington in the open, he won't hesitate to silence a penniless artist. Find out what she saw, earn her trust, do whatever it takes. Gideon gave a curt nod. It was just another job. Protect a frightened woman, coax a name out of her, and move on. He had no illusions about it. Trust was a commodity he rarely traded in. He moved into the room adjoining mine at Mrs. Gable's boarding house. His presence was a constant, oppressive weight. The floorboards groaned under his heavy tread, the scent of pipe tobacco and damp wool seeped under my door. The first few days were a battle of wills I was destined to lose. He would sit across from me at the small table in my room, a notebook and a pencil in his hand, his gray eyes boring into me. Just write his name, he'd said on the first day, his voice a low rumble. He pushed the paper towards me. My hand shook so violently I could barely grasp the pencil. The face was there, behind my eyes, a perfect, chilling portrait. But when I tried to bring it forth, my muscles locked. Terror was a physical barrier, a paralysis that spread from my throat to my fingertips. The charcoal snapped in my hand. He let out a huff of exasperation, snatching the paper back. He tried again and again, his questions growing shorter, more clipped. Was he tall, short, fair hair, dark? He would gesture, point, using a crude sign language of his own invention. I could only shake my head, my eyes flooding with frustrated tears. I felt like a failure, a child. His impatience was a wall between us, and my fear was the mortar holding it together. He saw my silence as stubbornness, and I saw his questions as an assault. My life became a small, circumscribed world, my room, the hallway, and the parlor downstairs, all under his watchful, weary eye. If I went to the window, he would be there, a shadow in the corner of my vision, scanning the street below. He followed me on my brief, necessary trips to the market, a few paces behind, his hand never far from the weighted cosh tucked in his belt. The only solace I found was with Mrs. Gable. She was a stout woman with kind eyes and hands that were always dusted with flour. She didn't press me for words. She would bring me tea and sit with me, talking about the weather, about her late husband, about the price of eggs. She seemed to understand that the silence was a wound and it needed time to heal, not to be prodded and poked. I would communicate with her through small gestures, a nod for yes, a slight shake of the head for no, a hand to my chest to express gratitude. One afternoon, as I was helping her shell peas, Gideon stood in the doorway, watching. I didn't see pity in his expression, but something else, a clinical, professional curiosity. He saw that I could communicate, that I could form connections and express myself. I just couldn't or wouldn't do it with him. The thought seemed to annoy him even more. The danger, which had been an abstract fear, became chillingly real a week into Gideon's guardianship. He had insisted I get some air, and we were walking through a bustling market square, the air thick with the smell of roasted chestnuts and sawdust. He was, as always, a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. I was distracted by a stall selling colorful ribbons, a small moment of normalcy in my fractured life. A dray, piled high with barrels, was rumbling down the lane. It was a common sight, but then one of the horses seemed to shy, a sudden violent movement. The driver fought with the reins, but the heavy cart swerved directly towards me, picking up speed. There was no time to think. One moment I was looking at a bolt of blue silk, the next, a wall of splintering wood and horseflesh was bearing down on me. A hand like a vice gripped my arm, and I was violently shoved sideways. I stumbled and fell, landing hard on the cobblestones. Gideon had thrown himself between me and the cart, taking the impact with his shoulder. The cart scraped past, the iron-rimmed wheels missing us by inches as the driver finally regained control, shouting apologies. Gideon was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of cold fury. He ignored the pain in his arm, his eyes already scanning, searching the faces in the panicked crowd for anyone who looked out of place, anyone who might have been watching too intently. He found no one. He turned back to me, his expression grim. "Stay close," he barked, pulling me to my feet. His touch was rough, impatient, but for the first time I felt a tremor of something other than fear of him. It was a sliver of gratitude. The attack, if that's what it was, had been too sudden, too perfectly timed to be a random accident. The killer knew where I was, and he was getting bolder. That night, Gideon's frustration seemed to curdle into a new kind of resolve. He realized his direct, bullying approach was a complete failure. The next morning, he entered my room without a notebook, without a single question. In his hands, he held a canvas bag. He emptied its contents onto my small table. The objects rattled and clinked, a strange collection of personal effects. A silver snuff box, intricately engraved. A gentleman's walking stick with a polished brass handle, a pair of spectacles, a small torn swatch of dark blue wool. "From the scene," he said, his voice flat. "From Harrington." He didn't ask me to speak or write. He simply pulled up a chair and waited, watching my face. My eyes scanned the items, my heart beginning to race. The snuff box meant nothing. The spectacles, the walking stick, they were just things. But then my gaze fell on the piece of fabric. It was fine wool, expensive, and there was a small embroidered crest near the torn edge, a detail I hadn't consciously registered that night, but now recognized with a jolt of primal fear. My breath hitched. A small involuntary flinch went through my body. I couldn't hide it. Gideon's eyes narrowed. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a word of praise. He simply reached out and pushed the scrap of wool an inch closer to me, then made a brief note in a small book he produced from his pocket. It was a tiny victory, a single crack in the wall of my silence. No words had been exchanged, but he had heard me, all the same. The dynamic between us began to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. He stopped demanding answers and started observing. He saw that my only outlet, my only means of processing the world, was through my art. The day after the incident with the fabric, he entered my room and placed a brand new sketchbook and a set of fine German charcoals on the table. He didn't say a word, just left them there and walked out. It wasn't a gift offered in kindness, it was a tool provided for a purpose. He wanted me to draw. I hesitated at first, but the lure of the clean paper and sharp charcoal was too strong. I began to draw again. Not the killer's face, not yet, but the world around me. I drew the view from my window, the crooked chimney pots, and the lazy spirals of smoke. I drew Mrs. Gable's cat sleeping in a patch of sun. I drew the objects on my mantelpiece. I was reclaiming my hands, my art, from the paralysis of fear. One evening, Gideon returned late. He was tired, his shoulders slumped. He had spent the day chasing down leads that went nowhere, interviewing Harrington's associates, all of whom presented a united front of grief and ignorance. He sat at the table in my room, which had become our unspoken neutral ground, cleaning his pistol, the metallic clicks echoing in the quiet. I watched his hands. They were large, scarred and calloused, but their movements were precise, economical. They were a runner's hands, capable of both violence and a strange kind of care. Without thinking, I picked up my sketchbook and began to draw them. I captured the network of scars on his knuckles, the tension in the tendons, the focused competence of his task. When he finished, he looked up and saw me watching him. I slid the sketchbook across the table. He looked down at the drawing of his own hands. He studied it for a long time, his expression unreadable. For the first time, I felt as if he saw me, not as a broken witness, but as a person with a skill, a perspective. He felt seen. He pushed the sketchbook back without a word and left the room. The next morning, a small stack of high-quality, heavy stock paper was sitting on my table. It was the longest conversation we had ever had. While Gideon wrestled with my silence, Julian Hayes began to move. He was a man accustomed to control, and the existence of a loose end, an unknown witness, frayed his nerves. He couldn't afford to be reckless, but he couldn't afford to be idle either. He presented himself to Magistrate Collins as a grieving friend and junior partner of the deceased Lord Harrington, a man desperate for justice. He was the picture of decorum and sorrow, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his voice a low, concerned murmur. "Magistrate, I only wish to help," he'd said, his handsome face etched with worry. "Harrington was like a father to me. This senseless brutality, is there anything at all, any lead, any witness?" Collins, a man who had judged character for 30 years, felt a prickle of unease at Hayes's polished performance. It was too smooth, too perfect. "The investigation is ongoing, Mr. Hayes," the magistrate had replied coolly. "We are pursuing several avenues." Hayes had pressed, subtly trying to ascertain what exactly the runners knew. "I heard a rumor," he'd ventured, "that a young woman was found near the scene. Is she able to assist you?" Collins had been evasive, but Hayes was an expert at reading men. He left the office with the unnerving certainty that the witness existed and that the runners were protecting her. When Gideon learned of the visit, his suspicion, which had been a form of professional instinct, hardened into something sharp and dangerous. The wolf had come sniffing at the shepherd's door. Our strange, silent life continued. We were two isolated souls, trapped together by circumstance. The walls of the boarding house were thin, and some nights I would be woken by sounds from his room. Not the usual creak of floorboards or the rustle of papers, but a choked cry, a muffled shout, as if he were fighting an unseen enemy in his sleep. I knew little of his life before he had appeared in my doorway, but I sensed he was haunted by ghosts of his own. One morning, after a particularly rough night, he emerged from his room looking gaunt, the scar over his eye a livid white against his pale skin. He was more withdrawn than usual, the fortress of his silence thicker than ever. He sat at the table, staring into a cold cup of tea, lost in thoughts I couldn't begin to guess at. I wanted to offer some small comfort, but I had no words, so I used the language I had. I took a piece of paper and quickly sketched a steaming cup of tea, the rising vapors curling into a soft, inviting pattern. I slid the drawing onto the table in front of him. He looked down at it, then up at me. His gray eyes held a flicker of surprise, of something vulnerable. He understood the gesture perfectly. A moment of shared humanity, a recognition of each other's pain. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was more eloquent than 1,000 words of thanks. The new paper he'd given me felt like an invitation, a challenge. I knew what he wanted. He wanted the killer's face. I still wasn't ready for that. The memory was too sharp, too terrifying, but I could get closer. Gideon, sensing a shift in my willingness, brought me a stack of society gazettes and magazines, their pages filled with engraved portraits of London's elite. "Look," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Point, if you see him." I spent hours poring over the faces, stern-faced bankers, foppish aristocrats, decorated military men. None of them were him. My frustration grew. Was he a ghost? Had I imagined him? Then I turned a page, and my breath caught in my throat. It was an engraving of a group of men standing outside a newly opened city club. One of them, a man named Lord Ashworth, had a face that meant nothing to me, but on the lapel of his coat was a small, distinctive pin. It was an intricate design, a serpent coiled around an anchor. It was the same design as the crest on the scrap of wool from the crime scene. It was the same pin the killer had worn. My hand shot out, my finger trembling as I pointed not at the man's face, but at the tiny detail on his coat. Gideon leaned in, his eyes sharp. He didn't recognize the pin at first, but he saw the violent reaction it provoked in me. He took the magazine, tearing the page out carefully. "A new thread to pull," he murmured, more to himself than to me. He now knew the killer belonged to an exclusive world, a world with membership lists and secrets. The new lead made our killer nervous. The attempts to silence me became more direct, more desperate. One night, a thick fog rolled in from the Thames, blanketing the city in a damp, gray shroud that muffled all sound. I was asleep, but a faint, scratching noise pulled me from my dreams. I lay frozen in bed, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from my door. Someone was trying to force the lock. Before I could even think to move, I heard a sudden, violent crash from the hallway. Gideon, who apparently slept with the instincts of a wolf, had burst from his room. I heard the scuffle, the grunts of exertion, the sickening thud of a fist hitting flesh. It was a brutal, shockingly quiet fight, two men struggling for their lives in the narrow, dark corridor. I scrambled from my bed, pressing my ear to the door. I heard a window sash being thrown open, a desperate scramble, and then silence. I cautiously opened my door. Gideon was leaning against the opposite wall, breathing heavily. A long, dark gash ran down his forearm, his sleeve soaked with blood. The would-be killer had escaped across the rooftops, swallowed by the fog. Gideon looked up, his face pale in the moonlight. I rushed to my wash basin, grabbing a clean linen handkerchief. I approached him hesitantly. For the first time, I initiated contact. I reached out and gently took his injured arm, pressing the cloth to the wound. My hands were shaking, my eyes wide with a terror that was no longer just for myself. It was for him. In that moment, he ceased to be just a guard. He was a man who had bled for me. The professional barrier between us, already cracked, shattered completely. He didn't pull away. He simply watched me, his expression softening as he looked at my terrified, determined face. The silence in the hallway was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, fragile trust. "We can't stay here." The words were flat, final. The next morning, Gideon packed a small bag for me with brisk efficiency. Mrs. Gable wrung her hands, her face a mask of worry, but she didn't argue. Gideon's authority was absolute. He bundled me into a closed, unmarked carriage, and we rumbled out of London, leaving the familiar city streets behind for the winding country lanes of Surrey. He took me to a small, isolated cottage, tucked away in a copse of birch trees. It was his own place, a bolt hole he clearly kept for emergencies. It was sparse, utilitarian, with little more than a fireplace, two cots, a table, and a few chairs. But it was safe. The air was clean, and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the cry of distant birds. The forced proximity of the cottage changed everything. There were no more adjoining rooms, no more landlady to act as a buffer. We were utterly alone. We fell into a strange domestic routine. He would chop wood for the fire, his axe strokes ringing out in the crisp air. I would tend to the small, neglected vegetable patch I found behind the cottage. We took our meals together in silence, the quiet no longer awkward or strained, but comfortable, companionable. One afternoon, he took me out into the small clearing behind the house. He pressed a small, heavy lady's pistol into my hand. "You need to know how to use this," he said. "I can't be everywhere at once." My hands shook as I held the cold metal. He stood behind me, his larger, warmer hands closing over mine to steady my grip. He guided my aim, his voice a low murmur in my ear, explaining the mechanism, the kickback, the need to breathe before squeezing the trigger. His presence was solid, reassuring. The contact was entirely professional, a teacher instructing a student, but it was the most intimate touch I had experienced in my life. I could feel the warmth of his chest against my back, smell the faint scent of wood smoke and leather that clung to him. I was leaning on him, trusting him not just with my life, but with my fear. That night, a storm rolled in, rattling the windows of the small cottage. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The sense of safety, of being hidden away from the world, finally loosened the knot of terror in my chest. I sat at the table, a fresh sheet of paper in front of me, the fine German charcoal cool against my fingers. I closed my eyes and let the image come, the face from the alley, the cold, handsome features, the arrogant set of the jaw, the deadness in the eyes. This time, my hand didn't shake. The charcoal moved across the paper with a life of its own, driven by a will to exorcise the demon that had haunted my waking moments and my dreams. The lines were sharp, certain. I drew the patrician nose, the thin, cruel line of his mouth. And finally, I drew the eyes, pouring all the coldness, all the remorseless emptiness I had seen into them, Beside the portrait, I carefully drew the lapel pin, the serpent coiled around the anchor, rendering every tiny detail from memory. It took me less than an hour. When I was finished, I felt lighter, as if a poison had been drawn from my veins. Gideon was sitting by the fire, cleaning his weapons, as was his nightly ritual. I stood up and walked over to the table where he worked. I placed the drawing in front of him. He stopped what he was doing and looked down at the paper. He stared at the face for a long, silent minute, his own face as hard as granite. He picked up the drawing, his eyes moving from the portrait to the intricately drawn pin. He then looked up at me. He didn't need to ask if this was the man. He could see it in my eyes, in the exhausted resolve that had replaced the terror. He finally had his killer's face. He tapped the portrait with a single calloused finger. "Julian Hayes," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The name was not a question, but a confirmation. He had been looking into the members of the club, and the name was already on his list of suspects. Now, he had certainty. He was no longer just a protector. He was a hunter. And now, he knew the name of his prey. Gideon understood the law and the men who twisted it. He knew that a drawing made by a mute, traumatized woman would not be enough to bring down a man as wealthy and well-connected as Julian Hayes. Hayes would buy the best lawyers. He would call upon powerful friends. He would paint me as an unstable hysteric, perhaps even an accomplice. A simple arrest was out of the question. They needed to catch him in the act of trying to silence me for good. They needed a trap. "He thinks you're a weakness," Gideon explained, his voice grim as he laid out the plan he hated himself for conceiving. "We'll make him believe you're about to become a strength." The plan was simple and terrifying. Gideon would use his contacts to leak carefully chosen information. A rumor would spread through the city's underbelly and eventually to Hayes's ears. The silent witness was being moved to a secure magistrate's office in Westminster. Her memory was returning, and she was preparing to give a full, written statement that would name the killer. The bait was my life. The location was chosen for its seeming security, a place Hayes would believe required a bold, final stroke to protect himself. The night of the trap was thick with tension. A storm lashed against the tall, arched windows of the magistrate's office, the wind howling like a hungry animal. The room was lit by a single, flickering gas lamp that threw long, dancing shadows across the walls of legal books. I sat in a high-backed chair, the small pistol Gideon had given me tucked into the folds of my dress, its weight a cold, hard knot of reality. He had insisted I have it. "Trust me, but trust this more," he'd said. He stood near the hearth, a solid, unmoving silhouette against the firelight. Two other trusted runners were hidden in the adjoining clerk's office, waiting for his signal. The wait was an agony. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind, sent a fresh jolt of fear through me. My hands were freezing. Gideon must have seen me trembling. He walked over and knelt before my chair. He took out a small, folded piece of paper and a pencil from his waistcoat. He scribbled a few words and handed it to me. I unfolded it. His script was rough, angular, like the man himself. It said, "You are the strongest person I know." I clutched the note in my hand, its simple, powerful words a shield against the mounting terror. I looked at him, and in his slate-gray eyes I saw not a runner guarding a witness, but a man protecting someone he cared for. The feeling was so new, so overwhelming, it almost eclipsed my fear. Hayes was clever. He didn't come through the heavily watched main entrance or the guarded corridors. His wealth had purchased more than just influence. It had purchased secrets. He used a dusty, forgotten servant's passage that connected to the building's cellar, a route known only to a handful of senior officials. A discreetly paid clerk had provided him with the key and the layout. He moved through the sleeping building with a predator's silence, emerging from behind a tapestry near the back of the office. He held a long, thin stiletto, its needlepoint gleaming in the firelight. He thought he was unseen. He saw me sitting alone, a perfect, helpless target. He stalked towards me, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He was enjoying this, the final satisfying act of tying up a loose end. "Such a shame," he whispered, his voice smooth and cultured, a horrifying contrast to the violence in his eyes. "No one can hear you scream. A mercy, in a way, just like Harrington." He bellowed like a stuck pig. He was close now, savoring my silent terror. He raised the knife. He was a sentimental old fool. Did you know that? He found my real ledgers, my private ventures. He was going to ruin me after everything I'd built. I made that empire, not him. He just had the name. Drop it, Hayes. Gideon's voice cut through the room like a whip crack. He stepped out from the shadows of the hearth, his own pistol leveled at Hayes's chest. The hidden runners burst in from the other room, flanking him. Hayes's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of shock, of disbelief, but it was immediately replaced by a cornered animal's snarl. He was faster than Gideon had anticipated. Instead of surrendering, he lunged, not at Gideon, but at me. He grabbed me, hauling me from the chair, and spinning me around to use as a shield. The cold, sharp point of the stiletto pressed against my throat. "Drop your weapons, runner," he hissed, his arm a band of iron around my chest. "Or she dies right here." Gideon froze, his face a mask of fury and desperation. The other runners held their positions, unable to get a clear shot. Hayes was in control. He began to drag me backwards, towards the secret passage. I could feel his heart hammering against my back, smell the faint, cloying scent of his cologne. My mind was screaming, a silent, frantic symphony of terror. And then, through the panic, I remembered the cottage, the feel of Gideon's hands over mine, his low voice in my ear. "Breathe, aim for the center, don't think, just act." It was now or never. I stomped down with all my might, my heel grinding into the fine leather of his expensive shoe. He roared in pain, a sharp, involuntary sound. His grip on me loosened for a fraction of a second, the knife moving an inch from my throat. It was enough. I brought the small pistol up, turning it in his grasp and shoving it hard against his side. I didn't aim. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. Hayes screamed, a high, strangled sound, and his arm flew away from me. The stiletto clattered to the floor. He stumbled back, clutching a blossoming red stain on his shoulder, his face a canvas of pure shock and agony. He stared at me, at the smoking pistol in my shaking hand, as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. In the ringing silence that followed the gunshot, a new sound filled the room. It was raw, ragged, torn from a throat long unused. A single broken whisper. Monster. My own voice. It felt alien, a stranger's sound, but it was mine. As Hayes gaped at me, Gideon moved in, a blur of motion, striking him hard at the base of the skull with the butt of his pistol. Hayes crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The fight was over. I dropped the gun, my entire body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. My eyes found Gideon's across the room. My voice was back. The immediate aftermath was a blur of controlled chaos. The other runners hauled Hayes's limp body up, securing his hands and feet. One of them went to fetch the magistrate, while the other stood guard. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and scorched wool, but Gideon saw none of it. He moved past his men, past the groaning villain on the floor, his focus entirely on me. I was leaning against the chair, my legs threatening to give out from under me. He came to a stop in front of me, his slate-gray eyes searching my face. They were filled with a fierce, raw emotion I had never seen in him before, a mix of profound relief and overwhelming pride. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. He gently, almost reverently, took my shaking hands in his. His touch was warm and steady, an anchor in the swirling storm of adrenaline and shock. I looked down at our joined hands, his scarred and calloused, mine stained with gunpowder, and then back up at his face. The single word I had spoken echoed in my mind, a miracle. I took a ragged breath and tried again, forcing another word from my throat, a name that had become the center of my world. Gideon. It was quiet, hoarse, but it was clear. It was the first time I had ever said his name aloud. A ghost of a smile, the first I had ever seen, touched the corners of his mouth. It transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, less burdened. The world could wait. In that moment, there was only the two of us, standing in the quiet aftermath of the storm we had weathered together. A few days later, I sat in that same office, but this time, the morning sun streamed through the windows, chasing away the shadows. I gave my official statement to Magistrate Collins. Gideon stood by the door, his arms crossed, a silent, unmovable sentinel. He had refused to leave my side. My voice was still hesitant at first, a fragile thing I was afraid of breaking. But as I recounted the events, from the rainy alley to the gunshot in the office, it grew stronger, more confident with every sentence. I was no longer the silent, helpless victim. I was the woman who had survived. My testimony, detailing Hayes's confession just before he attacked, combined with the discovery of his secret ledgers, found in a hidden compartment in his office, a location Gideon deduced from clues in Harrington's private journal, was enough to seal his fate. Hayes, his arm in a sling and his arrogance replaced by a venomous fury, tried to claim I was an unstable accomplice who had turned on him. But my testimony was unshakable. My quiet dignity, the irrefutable evidence, and the corroborating statements of 3 Bow Street runners left him with no defense. The case was closed. Gideon's assignment was officially over. He came to my room at the boarding house a week later to say goodbye. The air between us was thick with things unsaid. The silence we had once shared as a necessity had become a space of deep understanding, and now, with my voice returned, we were clumsy strangers, unsure of the new words. He stood by the door, turning his hat over and over in his hands. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "the magistrate sends his compliments, and his gratitude." "It was you I should thank," I replied, my voice soft. "You saved my life." "You saved your own," he corrected gruffly, unable to accept the praise. He started, then stopped, frustrated by his own inability to express himself. Words were not his tools, action was. He thrust a small, flat package wrapped in brown paper towards me. "For your work," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on a point just over my shoulder. I carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a beautiful, professional set of imported drawing pencils and charcoals, nestled in a velvet-lined wooden box. It was more than a gift, it was a sign of respect. For my talent, for my courage. It was the most eloquent speech he could have possibly made. My eyes filled with tears. He saw them and shifted uncomfortably, preparing to make his escape. He turned to leave. "Don't go," I said, the words surprising me as much as they did him. He stopped, his back to me. "My place is here," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the sprawling, grimy city. "The work is here." I took a step closer. "And mine is here," I agreed. "But it's quiet. Too quiet, now." The unspoken plea hung in the air between us. He slowly turned back to face me, and the question in my eyes was answered by the hope dawning in his. The seasons turned. Autumn's chill gave way to the crisp blanket of winter, which in turn melted into the tentative green of spring. 6 months after Julian Hayes was sentenced to transportation for life, my own life had found a new, quiet rhythm. I had taken a position teaching art to young children at a small parish school for orphans in a less fashionable part of London. My own trauma, the memory of that suffocating silence, had given me a unique well of patience and empathy. I found a special purpose in helping the shyest children, the ones who hid behind their own walls of silence, find a way to express themselves through color and shape. There was one little boy, Thomas, who hadn't spoken a word since arriving at the orphanage. I didn't press him. Instead, I just sat with him, drawing, until one day he picked up a piece of blue chalk and drew a small, perfect bird. It was a beginning. I was helping others find their voice, and in doing so, strengthening my own. One bright spring afternoon, a familiar, solid figure appeared in the doorway of my small classroom. Gideon looked entirely out of place amidst the tiny chairs and the walls covered in cheerful, chaotic paintings. He was dressed in a respectable suit, no longer the grim, functional attire of a runner. He watched me for a moment as I helped Thomas mix green paint, a rare, genuine smile on his face. When the children were dismissed, he walked in, his presence still commanding but softened now, the hard edges worn smooth. He told me he had left the runners. "Magistrate Collins offered me a new post," he explained, looking at a particularly vibrant finger painting of a house. "Investigator for the Crown. Financial crimes. Fraud. Embezzlement. More paperwork. Less rooftop chases." He looked at me, a wry twist to his lips. "Turns out, listening is more important than shouting. And reading ledgers is safer than dodging knives." It was his version of telling me he had chosen a different path, a safer one, for me. We left the school and walked together through a nearby park where Londoners were enjoying the first real warmth of the year. The conversation flowed easily now, without the weight of danger or unspoken fears. We talked of my students, of his new, frustratingly complex cases. It was normal. It was beautifully, wonderfully normal. As we walked beneath a canopy of blossoming cherry trees, he reached out and took my hand. His was still calloused and scarred from his old life, and mine was perpetually smudged with charcoal from my new one. Our hands fit together as if they were made to. There was no grand declaration of love, no passionate speech. There was only a quiet, solid understanding that had been forged in the crucible of silence and fear, and had now been given voice in the sunlight. The connection we had found without words was now a bond that could withstand anything. The silence had been my prison, but it had also been my sanctuary. It had forced me to learn a new language, a language of observation, of gesture, of trust. It had brought me a man who understood that language better than anyone, a man who saw me when no one else could. I had found my voice again, not just in the words I could now speak, but in the courage to face my fears, the strength to define my own life, and the wisdom to know that the most profound connections are often the ones that don't need words at all. Julian Hayes took my voice, but Gideon Blackwood, in his own gruff, silent way, helped me find it again, stronger and clearer than it had ever been before. He taught me that sometimes the only thing you need to hear is the steady, reassuring presence of someone who refuses to let you face the darkness alone. And what would you do if the thing you feared most became your greatest source of strength? I'd love to read about your own experiences with overcoming silence or fear in the comments below. Sharing our stories is how we remind each other that we're not alone on our journeys. If my story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding the light in unexpected places. And if you know someone who might need to hear this, feel free to share it with them. Thank you so much for joining me today and for listening. I hope my story inspires you to listen to the silences in your own life. You never know what you might hear.